Static routes have been part of CCNA since it started over 25 years ago. In this next lab, you'll get a chance to practice lots of those IP route commands. Let's set it up. So some context. I've written some books, the CCNA official cert guides, so this lab happens to match content in the volume 1 of that 2-volume set in part 5, chapter 17. So at my blog site, I've put a bunch of config labs, that is single-page lab exercises that begin with the scenario and tasks for the lab, and then an admonition to say, hey, go do the lab. You can do it in Cisco Packet Tracer or in Cisco Modeling Labs in many cases. Then the bottom half of the web page gives you the answer and explanation. For some of those labs, I've been adding videos, an intro video like this one, and then a review video, which there's a matching one for this lab, so you can look at that as well later once you've done the lab exercise. All right, last bit of context. Here's the link. You can type that in. There should be a link appearing up above my head here in YouTube as well, so you can click that. The link is also in the description if you want to go there. There's the name of the lab. It's all about static routes and practicing those. All right, let's talk about the lab. So let's get into the router topology. We've got 4 routers, core, and 3 branch offices with WAN links between the core and each of the branches. And we've got a LAN interface off each of the branches on the bottom part of the figure. In the blog page, I've got the IP addresses represented in shorthand, but here I've spelled them out with the IP address and then slash in the mask. Notice we've got addresses in 3 different subnets of network 10 here, and then 3 different Class C networks that begin 192.168 used down here at the bottom of the diagram. Additionally, I've placed some PCs in those subnets here, so if you want to test your routes later, you can get into these PCs and issue ping and trace route commands to test. Now let's talk about these initial configurations on the devices. On router core, it's got a host name. It's got 3 interfaces shown that match the interfaces in the diagram. It's got an IP address and mask configured to match the diagram, and it's got a no shutdown command confirming that when you bring the lab up, the interfaces really should be up and working. They will be in Packet Tracer and CML. Last thing, not shown in the blog page, is I added this router OSPF1 command here in the video and put a line through it just to emphasize OSPF is not pre-configured. No routing protocol is pre-configured. The lab does not ask you to add a routing protocol. There's no routing protocol. What are we using instead? Static routes. All 3 branches follow the same style of initial config as well. The branches all have a WAN interface that's gig 01 and a LAN interface that's gig 02. So the initial config has a host name configured. The LAN and WAN interface is configured with the IP addresses per the figure, a no shutdown command configured, and of course, as before, no routing protocol in use. So what does the lab ask you to do here? Well, first it says configure routes to, quote, all subnets. So you've got some work to do. You've got to calculate the subnet IDs because the lab itself doesn't tell you what those are. It gives you interface addresses and not subnet IDs. You also have to choose which routes to add. All right, so there'll already be some routes in the network. So you got to pick which ones are missing and add static routes for those. And you need to figure out the syntax of the IP route command, which isn't hard, but that's what the practice is for. So you get better at that until it's second nature. Now, the lab doesn't emphasize this, but you could also prove the lab works. You could ping or trace route from each device to every address. Now, that'd be laborious, and I have some tips for you on that as well in the review video. All right, so those are your marching instructions. Now, warning, I'm going to give away some of the work you have to do for that now. So if you want to skip ahead and get busy on the lab, that's fine. All right, but here's the idea. What routes do you need? That's one of the questions you're having to ask yourself. So think about this from the core router's perspective. Well, it's got 3 interfaces with IP addresses that are up. And that means it will add connected routes for the subnets where these yellow blobs have appeared in the slide. So the core router is not going to need static routes for those connected subnets, right? It's already got a route for those connected subnets. Which ones does it then need static routes for? Well, the ones at the bottom. If you see these IP addresses in blue down at the bottom, those are ones for which if you went to the core router at the start of the lab and tried to ping those from the core router, the ping would fail. So if we remove those from the diagram, you need routes so that pings from the core router to those addresses down at the bottom, that those would work. Similarly, if we think through that problem from, say, branch 1's perspective, what routes does it have before you perform the lab? Well, branch 1 has two interfaces that are up with IP addresses, so it'll have routes to two subnets, the ones you see here and here with the yellow blob. So what kind of routes do you need to add on branch 1? One's to make it so that branch 1 could forward packets to all the rest of these IP addresses over here, which I'll remove them from the drawing. So I'll leave it to you then to take that information and think about what routes need to be added. Now, if you're using Cisco Packet Tracer, you can go ahead and do the lab now. Here's a link to the blog page to do it. If you plan to use CML, keep watching. I'll give you a few more tips on that. The first issue at making a lab support CML, and specifically CML-Free, is that the routers in CML-Free don't use the same interface ID numbering scheme as the routers in Packet Tracer. So the figure in the lab exercise on the blog page matches Cisco Packet Tracer. So if you're going to do the lab in CML, it's going to use a router image that requires different interface IDs. All right, so if you download the file and use it, here's the deal. All these interface IDs in the original blog page figure that have G for gigabit, they're going to change to E for Ethernet, but the numbers don't change for this lab. All right, turns out we could use the exact same numbers, just different type. Gigs changes to E, see the E's here? And look at the 3-branch routers, they're going to change G to E, but the numbers stay the same. So keep that in mind as you work through the lab. Next, we've got those 3-branch routers and the 3 PCs in the figure in the blog. And each of the PCs has an IP address, and there's this presumption that their settings are set up to point to the router IP addresses, respectively, as their default gateways. And for Packet Tracer, those are set up that way ahead of time, so that once you add all the static routes, then pings and trace routes from these PCs will work. For CML, if you're going to use CML-Free, you bump into the node count limit of 5 maximum nodes active at a time with this lab. So what I've done for this lab is I've used the router as many hosts configuration, where I replace these 3 PCs that would count as 3 nodes in your 5 node limit. I replace them with one router, and this router, through config you don't have to worry about, will mimic 3 different hosts and still let you test with ping commands. Now, if that's a surprise to you, it's like, what is he talking about? I've got a couple of way more detailed videos about how that works. So I've just warned you up front that you'll see that. I've got links to those in the description. They're probably popping up above my head here as well, if you want to go check those out and get background there before you do this lab on CML. All right. But here's the idea. When you're ready to test from a PC that doesn't exist in CML in this lab, in order to test from the first PC, the first host, you start with ping VRF host 1 and then the address you want to ping. If you want to do a trace route as if you're at host 2, you do this command and so on. So here's ping, trace route, telnet, and SSH command syntax. But those other 2 videos are way more detailed and useful until you get used to this router as many host trick, which lets you run these labs for free in CML. Hey, if you haven't already done so, go do the lab. All right, so do it in Cisco Packet Tracer or in Cisco Modeling Labs free. And after that, if you'd like to use the review video to get a little deeper look at the answers, great. But the answer and explanation always sits at the blog page for the lab as well. Thanks for watching the whole video. If you're new to the channel, you know the drill. Click subscribe and the bell if you'd like to get more like this. And as always, likes, comments, shares are a big help to me to help the channel grow. Thanks for hanging out. Talk to you soon.